I absolutely love talking with this guy every week on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. I call him the civilian GOAT because I think he is the best film watcher and film breakdowner, if that's a word, of anybody that did not play or coach in the NFL. He's been doing what he's doing a lot longer than a lot of people have been doing what they've been doing. 45 plus years. He is the great Greg Cosell. Joins me typically Thursdays on the Ross Tucker Podcast. But we got to talk quarterbacks because there's a bunch of teams that need them. Greg, always great to talk with you. We're doing it twice this week, not just once. Appreciate the time. I guess let's start with the college guys because there's going to be at least one, maybe more, NFL teams that find their starting quarterback via the draft. And so is there a guy that was a clear number one? And when you broke down Shedeur Sanders and Ward and all these guys, who kind of jumped out to you?
Yeah, and I think just before I give you that person and people who maybe listen to us and to listen to me know that I believe it's Cam Ward, but I think the important point to remember is quarterbacks have different traits and different attributes and different characteristics. That doesn't mean that they can't play in the league. It just means that the variables that come into play, the different variables that come into play, Ross, and you know this having played in the league, now you start getting into things like team, scheme, players around them, coaching. You know, there's so many factors involved that just because a quarterback might not be high on my list or might not be number one doesn't mean he can't play in the league. It's just you have to understand what their traits and attributes are and what that means when you project them. So I thought when I watched Cam Ward, I thought that he was the most physically gifted of the quarterbacks in this draft, that he had high-level traits in order to, ideally become a good player in the league. He's got a live arm. He's got a playmaking dimension to his game. Obviously, he's got some things he has to clean up. I actually watched him speak at the podium at the Combine, and he said quite clearly, which is true, that there were times he held the ball too long, and that some sacks are on him, and that's something he has to clean up. And I think that's another thing that people have to realize is that none of these quarterbacks enter the league as a finished product, and there's things that have to be coached and developed, and that takes time, and those things can show up in the NFL, and it doesn't mean that they're going to be bad players. So there's so many factors involved, but I thought clearly Cam Ward, to me, was a defined number one quarterback prospect in this draft class.
And so, and we know he's going to get drafted where he's going to get drafted, but when you look at him, Greg, did you think like number one pick type quarterback?
I started to feel that way the more I watched him, yes. And again, it may or may not happen. When you hear the Tennessee Titans brass talk, you kind of get the sense they hold a number one pick, that they'd like to get more players because their roster is kind of depleted. So I don't know. Again, you never know if teams want to trade up. We won't know that, probably for a while. But I started to feel the more I watched Ward, and I just want people to understand that I watched him last summer, 7-8 games at Washington State. I think I watched 9 games this year at the University of Miami. And the more I watched him, as I said, there are definitely things that need to be cleaned up. There's no question. There's a little bit of a looseness and lack of discipline at times to his game. That must be coached hard. But he can work the pocket. He can make progression throws. He can make outstanding outside of structure throws, which were prevalent throughout his tape. So I came to believe that, yes, he could be that kind of prospect.
All right, some of these other guys, Greg, Shedeur Sanders and Jackson Dart, just watching the video, which is what you do, was there, who would you say was the next most impressive guy on video?
I mean, if you're just going by tape, and again, I'm not going to sit here and say this is where guys are going to get drafted, but I would say just watching tape, I came away really impressed with Tyler Shuck out of, he played for 3 teams in his college career, but he ended up this year at Louisville. It was the first year that he truly played as a full-time starter and played pretty much all the games. I mean, he came out of Arizona. It seems like he came out 20 years ago as one of the top-rated quarterbacks in the country. But again, he's a very intriguing player because of his age, which, by the way, most GMs don't view that as a problem. It's more the injury history. But I thought that he did a lot of the little things really well. Ball security, always kept both hands on the ball when forced to move out of the pocket, whether climbing or escaping laterally. He has a very easy delivery. He worked from a firm base. He could sit on his back foot with bodies around him and drive the football. Yet he could throw with pace and touch. He could layer throws. He had enough movement that he's not a playmaker, but he had enough movement where he's not a statue. I thought his traits were strong, and I thought his tape was really, really good. Now, again, I don't know where he's going to get drafted. I'm sure he's going to be polarizing in draft rooms. I'm sure there's some people listening right now that probably think, oh, he's a third round player and he's not going to make it. We don't know the answer to these questions, but the tape was very good. And you know what? He's 6'5" and he's 225. And as you know, Ross, having played in this league, that's a trait. There's a big difference between being 6'1" and 6'5" when you're a quarterback.
Talking with the great Greg Cosell from NFL Films here. You can check him out on social media at Greg Cosell. So I think a lot of people listening, Greg, on the Fox Sports Radio affiliates or watching on Peacock are probably surprised that the second most impressive quarterback to you was not Shedeur Sanders. So what did you see when you broke down Shedeur Sanders' tape, since there's obviously the subject of a lot of conversation?
And again, his tape's not bad. That's the issue you face, Ross, as you know this. You talk every single day, and you know the way people respond. What I'm about to say is not a knock at all on Shedeur Sanders. I just think you need to understand what kind of quarterback he is. And by the way, you can be very, very good in the league. He's an easy, natural thrower of the football. He does not have higher level arm strength, and that's a discussion that people have all the time about the relative merits of arm strength in the NFL. Some believe it's important. Some believe it's not one of the most important traits. That's a discussion people have all the time when they evaluate quarterbacks. You know, just as a quick aside, when I hear the phrase "he can make all the throws," that tells me he can't make all the throws. And I'm talking about Shedeur. I'm talking about when I hear that about quarterbacks in general. Because why are we saying that? So if a quarterback could make all the throws, then why are we even saying that? But anyway, getting back to Shedeur, I think Shedeur is much more of a ball distributor and executor of an offense. That's the style of quarterback he is. And by the way, you can be a really good quarterback in the NFL playing that way. I think, as with Ward, that I mentioned a few things that need to be cleaned up. There's a few things with Shedeur that need to be cleaned up. Number one, he has a tendency to hold the ball with one hand when he feels pressure. You know as well as I do that has to be cleaned up in the NFL. And that'll be one of the first things that's cleaned up, because you cannot give the ball away in the NFL. And second of all, he has a tendency to retreat backwards. You cannot retreat backwards in the NFL. But you're dealing with a guy that, at his best, is rhythmic. He's a distributor. He's an easy thrower. For the most part, his ball placement is pretty precise. There's a lot to like, but I think he's a ball distributor. I think in some ways, I thought of C.J. Stroud when he came out of Ohio State. I thought Stroud was a better prospect in a number of ways, but they're both sort of at their core pocket quarterbacks. And, I think Sanders is not at the level of Stroud when Stroud came out, but he's that kind of player stylistically.
Interesting. Talking with Greg Cosell, I want to transition, Greg, to the veteran quarterbacks, because we've got free agency next week.
Yeah.
And there are guys that I think are going to find jobs. Sam Darnold, Daniel Jones, Justin Fields, Aaron Rodgers. Let's start with Darnold, because there still seems to be some debate as to whether or not he's the guy he was in the first 16 games last year, or he's the guy that he was in the last 2 games. What do you think any team that would sign Darnold will be getting with him?
Well, I think the discussion probably revolves around whether he's a scheme-specific player or whether you can put him in any scheme and be effective. Because don't forget, the year prior to Minnesota, he was a backup quarterback for the Niners. And then he went to Minnesota with Kevin O'Connell, who pretty much everybody understands is a really good pass game schemer. The schematics of that offense really present clean, defined throws for the quarterback at the intermediate and deeper levels. And that's a rarity in the NFL these days, with so many short balls being thrown. And Darnold was phenomenal at that. Here's a statistic that blew me away, and he led the league in passes that went more than 20 yards in the air, Ross, from the line of scrimmage. Think about that, more than 20 yards in the air from the line of scrimmage. Darnold completed 57% of his passes. That led the league. By contrast, Mahomes completed 26% of his passes. And I'm not suggesting Darnold's a better quarterback than Mahomes. That's not my
Nope,
point.
you already said it. It's on social media.
Yeah, there you go. So I mean, so I think that that's the discussion with Darnold as to whether you could sign him, plug him into any system, and he would be successful, or whether what he did a year ago was very foundationally a product of working with Kevin O'Connell. And that's probably one of those things that it's not a mathematical equation. No one knows the answer to that specifically. And that, I don't get into the money, but that will probably dictate what teams offer him. If people felt you could put him in any system, Ross, and he'd be great, he'd probably be in the 45, 50 million range. If people feel that that's not the case, he'll probably be closer to the 30, 35 million range, and we'll see where it goes from there. But we're dealing with a 6'4", 225-pound guy with a big arm, and need I say he can make every throw, Ross?
I love. Sorry,
Yeah.
Greg.
And of course, he's mobile; he can move as well.
Yep, absolutely love. Greg Cosell comes on the Dan Patrick Show and drops a stat of the day on Sam Darnold throwing it over 20 yards downfield. Greg, what about Daniel Jones? I'm curious about him. Is there any chance Daniel Jones could be this year's Sam Darnold or 2 years ago's Baker Mayfield, that he could be sort of the reclamation project in Cleveland or somewhere and play at a high level?
A true enigma for me, Ross, because up to this point, I'd have to say that I was wrong about him. I liked him coming out. Now, I didn't like him the way I thought he'd be Josh Allen, but I liked him coming out. And as we probably all remember, I know you do, his rookie year, he was very good. There was a sense coming off his rookie season that he could be, a quality NFL starting quarterback. Now, we can start looking at any number of reasons why it didn't happen. O-line, lack of weapons. But you have to also look at the player. And one of the things about Daniel Jones that I thought started to really show itself, and again, now you get into team, scheme, and other factors, is even though he is mobile as a straight line runner, he's fairly robotic in the pocket. And one thing that he lacks, and I think this is a really important trait, one thing that he lacks is pocket movement. And that's a difference between running out of the pocket. They're two totally different traits. Pocket movement is the ability to move within the pocket. Think of an area that's, smaller than, let's say, the size of a boxing ring, but, just to give you a sense of sort of confined space, to be able to move in the pocket, within the pocket, to avoid pressure. Keep your eyes downfield, maintain your focus, not lose your focus of the routes and the coverage, and still then reset your platform to deliver the ball. I think that that's a trait that he needs, that he hasn't really shown, and I think that's really imperative for the style of quarterback that he is.
Check him out on social media at Greg Cosell, so you know wherever he's at, especially when he joins me on Thursdays, typically on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Obviously, 45 years NFL films, just incredible. Greg, thank you so much as always.
Ross, really appreciate being on with you today. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I love the sports history stuff and what we learned. Very, very fired up.